Welcome and thank you for joining us today's webinar, Trauma, a Reoccurring Theme in Girls' Lives. My name is Carissa Rano and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be provided with a link to take a brief survey about today's presentation. You'll be able to access the link to the evaluation on the last slide of the PowerPoint. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also check out many of our previous webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Karen Francis from the National Girls Initiative to begin today's webinar.
Okay, and good afternoon, and thank you, Carissa. So hello, everyone. Hello to the over 400 participants that we have joining us here this afternoon, and welcome to the third webinar in the National Girls Initiative webinar series. Our webinar today is entitled Trauma, a Reoccurring Theme in Girls' Lives. My name, again, is Karen Francis, and I'm the co-director of the National Girls Initiative, and I'll also serve as the facilitator for this webinar today. So before I introduce our presenter this afternoon, I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk with you about the National Girls Initiative. So the American Institute for Research, in partnership with the National Crittenden Foundation, operate the OJJDP National Girls Initiative and collaborate to provide training and technical assistance to the field. The goals of the National Girls Initiative training and technical assistance are to support the development and capacity building in states, tribes, and local girls coalitions, to increase the effectiveness of juvenile justice and related fields to meet the needs of girls in or at risk of entering the justice system, and 3, to ensure that the needs of specific subpopulations of girls, such as young mothers, trafficked, tribal, immigrant, and LGBTQ, and crossover girls in the juvenile justice system are identified and addressed. So our presenter today is Dr. Stephanie Covington. Dr. Covington is an internationally recognized clinician, author, lecturer, and organizational consultant. With over 30 years of experience, she's noted for her pioneering work in the design and implementation of gender-responsive and trauma-informed services in public, private, and institutional settings. She is the author of numerous books and 10 research-based manualized treatment curricula to include Voices, a program of self-discovery and empowerment for girls. This program has been implemented in a variety of settings, including schools, juvenile probation, detention centers, and behavioral health agencies. Dr. Covington has worked to help institutions and programs in both juvenile and adult justice systems develop effective services for girls and women. She has provided training and consulting services to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes, the National Institute of Corrections, the Ministries of Justice in England, in Scotland, and Switzerland, the Correctional Services of Canada, the Bureau, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and many other state and local jurisdictions. In addition, she has helped to design women's services at the Betty Ford Center and was a featured therapist on the Oprah Winfrey Network, OWN TV, entitled Breaking Down the Bars. She is the co-director of the Institute for Relational Development and the Center for Gender and Justice located in La Jolla, California. So our webinar this afternoon with the objectives, next slide please. So Dr. Covington will walk us through a presentation where we have the objectives of to define trauma, informed and gender responsive, to explain the processes or the process of trauma and typical responses, to discuss the sexual abuse to prison research on girls and to describe effective programming for girls in the juvenile justice system. So it is my honor and my pleasure to now turn the webinar over to Dr. Covington.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I'm looking forward to the time we get to spend all together this afternoon. So we're going to be talking about girls, particularly about girls at risk. And first, I think it's important for us to sort of remind ourselves, what do we know about girls at risk? We know that they often come from families that are struggling with multiple issues such as poverty and substance abuse and violence. The girls themselves, as a majority, have low rates of serious and violent crime, but they're at much higher risk for status offenses, which I think is really important for us to hold on to this thought, because this is basically what brings them into the criminal justice system, the promiscuity, the truancy, the running away, often running away to survive abuse. So we see high incidence of physical and sexual abuse, high incidence of substance abuse, and we also see the girls' rate of involvement in the juvenile justice system is increasing, although their crimes aren't necessarily increasing. We have an overrepresentation of girls of color, and they're disproportionately victims of sexual violence. So this theme of violence and trauma permeates the lives of girls who are at risk for juvenile justice involvement. And just some statistics give you an idea of different parts in the country where the juvenile systems tried to find out how much abuse was in girls' lives. You'll see that it's the vast majority of girls have experienced some type of abuse. When a girl has particularly experienced sexual abuse, this really has a profound effect on her in a variety of ways. There are those sort of personal ways, such as her own sense of self, her self-esteem, her difficulty with relationships and the inability to trust, often developing eating disorders, self-harming behavior, often a pregnancy that was unplanned. And what we also see is the running away, the use of substances, and this defensive and reactive violence, which of course, again, bring girls at very high risk of coming into the justice system. So what we can begin to see is a girl's life experience, and the events that happen in her life are often the driving forces for involvement in the juvenile justice system. A few years ago, they did a comparison study in where for 10 years, they did a study on girls who had experienced sexual abuse in their childhood. They followed them into their young adulthood. It was a comparison, randomized control comparison study with girls who had not experienced abuse. And what they found is the girls who had the experience of sexual abuse in their childhood, later in life there was more depression, more dissociative symptoms, meaning a mind-body split. They had a lot of difficulty with their development of their sexuality. They struggled with issues of obesity, the self-harming behavior. They also dropped out of high school at a higher rate. There were major illnesses and had been diagnosed with a whole host of different psychiatric labels. So this, again, this early childhood experience had an impact on what was going to happen later in their life. Now, the word trauma is used a lot, but I want to show you exactly kind of what it says in the diagnostic manual, because over the years it's changed. We used to consider trauma as an event. Now we realize it's an event with a particular kind of response. And the diagnostic manual, the 5th version that came out a couple of years ago, talks about, okay, it's an exposure to an event. You could experience it, or you could witness the event, or you could hear about it happening to someone you care about and love. And they added this new piece, this 4th bullet, where it's exposure to the details of traumatic events. And this is very important for all of you, because many of you are working with girls on a daily basis. You're hearing their stories, and this part really relates to what can happen to you when you're working with someone who has had traumatic experience in their lives, and you're in this position of hearing the stories. So the event can happen in these variety of ways, and then there has to be a particular response to the event. And it has to have a negative impact on people's relationships, or their capacity to work, or other areas of functioning. So we know that two people can experience the same event. One will be traumatized and the other may not be. Kind of a simpler definition, it's really when an external event overwhelms a person's ability to cope. They just do not have coping strategies to manage. The other thing we've learned about more recently is about toxic stress. And I know all of you know about stress, just given your work lives, I'm sure. But with regular, normal stress, we have a stressful day, and then the stress dissipates, and maybe the next day it's back again. But toxic stress is where the stress never goes away. It's just unrelenting. And this is particularly important when we think about children and the first 5 years of life. So toxic stress can be from poverty, racism, growing up in a violent family, growing up in a family where there's substance abuse. And what we have learned is because a child's brain is still in development, particularly those first 5 years, toxic stress has a very adverse reaction to the development of the brain. And the three primary areas that are impacted are the part of the brain that has to do with emotions, so it's difficult for the child to regulate their emotions. The part of the brain that has to do with behavior. Behavior often becomes unmanageable. And relationships. There's a lack of connection and trust. So I just want you to think for a moment about the girls you work with and think, how many of them do you believe grew up with toxic stress in those first 5 years? And I think you're going to find that you'd be answering, the majority of them. So the seeds for difficulties were really planted quite early in life. Now, as I said, traumatic events can take all different forms: the emotional, sexual, physical abuse, frightening medical procedures, witnessing violence, growing up, for example, in a violent home, losing a loved one. Certainly immigrating to this country can be traumatic for people. And human trafficking, I want to point out, this is particularly an important issue for girls in the juvenile justice system. We find many girls who've been trafficked who are then arrested on prostitution charges and end up being considered the person at fault, if you will. So this is a particularly important issue for us to understand. We're also understanding more about intergenerational or cultural trauma. And this is what happens to groups of people, and it gets passed from generation to generation. So in this country, this would be our Native American population, our African American population, our Native Hawaiians, for example, where a group of people have been traumatized, and historically this trauma passes, as I said, from generation to generation. The other form of trauma we often don't talk much about is the trauma of stigmatization. What happens to girls who in our society are stigmatized, and this can come from a variety of things, of course. Being a girl of color, living in poverty, a lesbian, transgender girl, having mental health problems. So when you think about the girls you're working with, I think what you're going to find is that you'll be very unusual if you're working with a girl who's had only one traumatic experience. Usually it's layers and a whole variety of different kinds of trauma that's impacting her life. I think it's also important for us to think about the gender differences with trauma. Now, over the years, we've talked about gender as male and female, but we're certainly beginning to understand that we cannot continue to talk about gender in a binary way. We certainly have a group of girls, particularly in the juvenile justice system, who are transgender girls or gender nonconforming girls. But let's talk about trauma specifically here. How we see difference is looking over the course of life. In childhood, children, boys and girls, are both pretty much at equal risk of physical and sexual abuse in their childhood, particularly from people they know. As a boy moves into adolescence, his greatest risk for harm actually comes from people who dislike him, such as if he's a young man of color, he's a gay young man, he may experience harm from his peers, from the police. If he's a gang member, it's the oppositional gang. Again, if he's a transgender youth, it's going to be, again, from people who dislike him. In adolescence, for a girl, her greatest harm comes from the person to whom she's saying, I love you. Her greatest harm comes from her relationships. If we move into adult life, what we begin to find out is, let's take a man who's serving in the military. His greatest risk for harm comes from the enemy. If he's living in our communities, in the free world, his greatest risk for harm comes from being a victim of crime committed by a stranger. But now contrast that to a woman. She serves in the military. Her greatest risk for harm comes from the people she's serving with. And if she's living in the free world in our communities, her greatest risk for harm actually comes from her relationships, from the person to whom she says, I love you. And we know for the transgender population, they have higher risk and higher rates of abuse than those who identify as male or female. There was a Canadian study, juvenile justice study, done a few years ago, in which one of the questions was, have you ever been raped or been in danger of being raped? And you'll see there that 47% of the females said yes, compared to 6% of the males. So we have to realize that boys and girls are growing up in a different world, that gender does matter, and there's certainly gender ramifications when we talk about trauma. So when we talk about trauma, we want to use both the trauma lens when we're thinking about working with girls, and we also want to use the gender lens. This chart, which looks a bit complicated, but I want to step you through it, really can show us and kind of explain what happens when there's a traumatic event. And because what so often happens is the trauma happens, and then we look at the results of that and try to do some kind of symptom management. But let's look here. So there's a traumatic event. As I said, it overwhelms the girl's capacity to cope. And the first response to trauma for most people is a fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what we hear about a lot. But other things begin to happen. There's an altered state of consciousness. There's sensations in the body. There's numbing, both physical as well as psychological numbing. Hypervigilance, sort of scanning the environment. And the body also was revved up. So over time, the girl develops a sensitized nervous system, and there are actually changes in the brain. And we believe that if there are multiple instances of childhood sexual abuse, these brain changes actually become chronic. And there's change in the brain chemistry and change in the way the brain functions. There's also a brain-body connection, and we've learned much more about all of this because of the more sophisticated brain scans that we now have available to us. And I'm not talking mind-body connection here. I'm actually talking brain-body. That the brain allows us to do everything with our body. And the brain sends messages to the body. But when the changes in the brain begin to happen, the messages to the body change, and we get physical health problems. So we'll get to that piece. So then we have someone who has a sensitized nervous system, they have changes in their brain, and then there's psychological or physical distress. And the current stressors can be having run away from home and living on the street. The current stressor could be being arrested. The current stressor could be being in detention. The current stressor could be being addicted to alcohol or another drug and trying to scramble to get the drug that your body is craving. Or the stressors could also come from triggers that are reminders of trauma. And triggers can be a feeling, an image, a sight, a sound, a smell. They can come from anywhere. And what happens is the person is triggered, the girl is triggered, and it pushes her back in time to the traumatic event, and she's flooded by the feelings that she had during the actual traumatic event. And then we see the next part here, the emotional and/or physical responses. So there's the retreat responses that we would consider our mental health responses. There's the isolation, the dissociation, which is the mind-body split, the depression, the anxiety. Many girls who go into isolation also drop out of school. They retreat. There's the harmful behavior to self, the substance use disorders, the eating disorders, the deliberate self-harm, and the suicidal action. And so we know that many girls come into the juvenile justice system with substance use disorders and also self-harming behavior, the cutting and the burning. There's the harmful behavior to others, the aggression, the violence, the rages, and the threats. And again, our standard anger management programs don't even address the source of this level of anger and violence. And then we have the physical health issues that can also happen: lung disease, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, obesity, and other types of physical health problems. So if we look at these 4 boxes at the bottom, what happens, unfortunately, at this point in time in our social service system is if we have mental health providers who often do not talk about trauma or think about trauma underneath the mental health diagnosis. We have substance abuse treatment providers who are not dealing with the trauma that's often underneath the substance abuse. We have anger management and working with girls who are aggressive, and we're trying to control their behavior without thinking about what's underneath that. And we have girls with a lot of physical health issues. And again, we're not thinking about what might be underneath that. So important to see how all of these are linked together. Here's kind of an abbreviation of that. So a girl experiences trauma, her brain and her body become overwhelmed, the nervous system is unable to return to equilibrium, the trauma goes untreated, she stays in a stress response mode. Cues in the environment continue to trigger the trauma. It could be loud voices, it could be searches, it could be seclusion, and then she reacts to these trauma cues from a state of fear. And what happens then, of course, people go into high control and things escalate, unfortunately. And when we look at the juvenile justice system, certainly we know that there are many possible triggers for girls. The restraints, the handcuffs, the isolation, the searches, the loud noises, the yelling. There are many, many different kinds of triggers that could actually create a response from the girls that then puts them at greater jeopardy in the system itself. Now, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which was done a number of years ago, but it has really helped us to see how many of the things that people struggle with are actually rooted in those first 18 years of life. And I'm going to give you 10 questions very quickly. What I'd like you to do, we probably won't have time to do it on this webinar, but at some point I would like you to answer these for yourself and also answer them for a typical girl that you work with. And just yes or no responses before age 18 about recurrent severe emotional abuse, recurrent severe physical abuse, contact sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect. And then before age 18, growing up in a household where both biological parents are not present, such as an out-of-home placement, foster care, mother being treated violently, a family member who is alcoholic or a drug user, a mentally ill, chronically depressed or family member who attempted suicide, and a family member being imprisoned. So these sort of simple 10 questions have been analyzed in a whole variety of ways over time and give us, again, all this is before age 18, and you're going to want to think about this, as I said, for yourself and also for the girls that you work with. And what we generally find, of course, is the girls in juvenile justice have very high numbers, and we'll look at some of those. So what did the research show? Well, first they looked at smoking, alcoholism, the injection of illegal drugs, and obesity. And they found that people who had a score of 4 or more yeses on those 10 questions were people 30, 40, 50 years later in their lives that were struggling with these in their adult lives. They also looked at this in terms of school performance, that those with an ACE score of 4 or more were likely either to have a learning problem or behavioral problem in school, 51% of them, versus people who had a score of 0. They looked at it in terms of suicide attempts. What happened if there was childhood trauma and then suicide attempts? That those with a score of 6 were 30 times more likely to attempt suicide. They looked at it in terms of alcoholism. People with a score of 4 or more were 5 times more likely to struggle with alcoholism than people with a score of 0. So you can begin to see that this fairly simple 10 questions about experiences before age 18 is highly predictive of problems people have later on in their life. The same questions, by the way, were taken into women's prison. They found women with a score of 4 or more. These were the women who had more mental health problems. They were in the med line with more physical health problems. And the women who had a score of 7 or more yeses, they had a 980% greater risk of having mental health problems. So clearly, this association, we know that many of the women in our prisons today were the girls in our juvenile system, and unfortunately many of the girls in our juvenile system are at risk of becoming the women in our adult system, which of course says something about a system not working well at all. Some of the scores on ACE scores that have been done on girls in juvenile justice and on boys with an ACE score of 5 or more, girls 45%, boys 24%. Crittenden also did an ACE pilot a couple of years ago looking at the girls served by the agencies in the Crittenden Foundation. You can see what percent of their girls had 4 or more or 5 or more than when they were young mothers, how their scores increased if they were in juvenile justice, what their scores were, and if they were in the welfare system. So again, we can see how important it is to understand the background and histories of the girls we're working with. Now there's trauma-informed and trauma-specific, and I think we've seen that, of course, understanding trauma is incredibly important in thinking about working with girls with juvenile justice involvement. Trauma-informed is basically how we provide our services. It's how we do business, if you will. Trauma-specific are the services that we give to girls who've had traumatic experiences to help them in the healing process. And so becoming trauma-informed is very important. We're beginning to realize that really everybody who works with people today needs to become trauma-informed. If you're working in juvenile justice, if you're working in adult corrections, if you're working in substance abuse, if you're working in schools, if you're working in hospitals, everybody needs to understand this and to begin to understand the impact of trauma, to avoid triggering people who are trauma survivors, adjusting the behavior, and helping survivors to really manage their traumatic symptoms. And the example that I most often use is my dentist, because it always surprises people, that my dentist decided that she wanted to become trauma-informed and have her staff become trauma-informed. And so here's how her office runs today. There are television sets on the ceiling, so you can watch television or listen to music. Everybody's told if they're uncomfortable in the dental chair, just let them know. You can get up and walk around. They have you do a breathing exercise, which is a grounding exercise before the heavy plates put on your chest before an x-ray. So they put several things in place so that a trauma survivor will be able to come to the dental office, because she intuitively knew that the dental office was filled with triggers, that sitting in a dental chair that tipped backward could be a trigger. Having someone lean over you could be a trigger. working in the mouth, because the mouth is so often involved in childhood sexual abuse. So if my dentist can become trauma-informed, I think we can see how important it is for all of us working with girls. And there's some basic core principles or values of trauma-informed care: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And this work comes from the work of Roger Fowlett and Maxine Harris, who wrote sort of the seminal book on this in 2001. And safety is about physical safety and emotional safety. It can be things like having eye contact, being consistent, being sure you explain what's going to happen. Trustworthiness, you do what you say you're going to do. If you're running a girls group at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the group starts at 2. Choice, and this becomes particularly important in correctional settings where often we take away everybody's choice. So finding the places where we can allow girls choice, having a sense of collaboration, having a girls committee or girls advisory group that gives input into how things are going, particularly if she's in a residential setting. And empowerment, are we really teaching girls skills that are going to help her to succeed? Now, when working with agencies that want to become trauma-informed, there's a real process that they go through, a structured process where they do a self-assessment, looking at the 5 core values and assessing where they are with those and what needs to change, looking at their policies, what kind of screening they do, what kind of assessment, what kind of trauma-specific services, what kind of administrative support is there, what kind of staff training is happening, how are you developing staff, and looking at your human resource practices. So it's very much about how you're running an organization. Because becoming trauma-informed really creates a culture shift, a shift in the culture of the organization. And it involves everything, everyone. It's not just picking up a curriculum and saying, oh, we're trauma-informed because now we're using this particular intervention. Again, it's about how we're doing business. It involves everybody. If you have van drivers, it involves the van driver. If you have cooks, it involves the cooks. It involves every part. We suggest people do walkthroughs, have the girls do walkthroughs with you, telling you what they see and experience, because often we don't see anymore when we've worked for a long time in various facilities. So it's really about changing everything we do. And so when you have a trauma-informed environment, all the staff understands about trauma. You've taken it into consideration. You're really focused on safety because that's totally critical. You eliminate any unnecessary triggers. And you also learn to identify and help the girls to identify what their individual triggers are. And the atmosphere needs to be really respectful and certainly to help her be able to make choices. Also to be culturally competent. The other thing is about this, and people often say, oh, well, now we've got to start assessing for girls. But let me just say, for example, my dentist does no assessment. It would be very odd for a dentist to do a trauma assessment. And so it's really what we learned from HIV and AIDS, that early on, if someone was positive, their chart was flagged and people did things to protect from the transfer of infection. But today we're all treated as though we're HIV positive. And this is where we're going with trauma-informed services. It's done across the board because it's totally helpful for the trauma survivor, and it doesn't harm the person who is not a survivor. So our rationale for becoming trauma-informed: it makes custodial facilities safer, it makes staff jobs easier, and programming becomes more effective. So these are the 3 things that we have found happen when programs actually go through the process to become trauma-informed across the board. And one key thing is really beginning to change the question we say to ourselves. And we all need to think about this. Something happens and we say in our mind, I wonder what's wrong with her. And the question really needs to be, what has happened to her? And in changing this question, we begin to change our attitudes. We begin to change how we think about her. And we begin willing to look at what's underneath and specific to what's happening versus looking at what we're seeing externally, which may be a manifestation of trauma. So changing this question. So what are the key elements? There are really three things, and it's the same thing for staff as well as for the girls. It's really learning what trauma is and what abuse is. We cannot assume that staff really know this. When I gave you those 10 ACE questions, and I suggest you take time to answer them for yourself, the reason for that is that we know that many of the staff that work with girls have trauma and abuse in their histories. And often in their adult life, they've just sort of moved this along or pushed this aside, when in fact it's really important to think about if this is part of your history and you're working in the field and you're working with girls with this experience, there's also the possibility that you'll be triggered. And this could be make work particularly difficult. So for staff, highly recommend self-care. Okay? You've got to learn to take care of self. Girls who've experienced trauma and abuse, often they don't acknowledge it as that. Because for many of them it's common. It's what happens in their family, it's what happens in their neighborhood, and this is not how they see it. It's really important for staff and girls to understand what the typical responses are when someone has a trauma history. That many of the things that people are struggling to control really are connected to the traumatic experiences in her life. And when we can begin to look through the trauma lens, we begin to understand the behavior better. And then we learn different and more successful ways to respond to all this. And the third one is coping skills. Staff need coping skills, and the girls need coping skills. You know, one of that earlier slide that I showed you talked about trauma is an external event that overwhelms someone's ability to cope. And so they need coping skills. The girls need coping skills. So staff and the girls essentially need the same three basic things. So we've been talking about trauma and becoming trauma-informed and what happens with trauma. But then we have the question of how do we develop services for girls? What are we actually going to do with what we know? Well, first, here's a definition that a colleague and I developed a number of years ago about being gender responsive. And we said that to have gender responsive treatment or services, it's really two pieces. One is the environment you create, and the other is the content and the kinds of interventions you use. So the definition here is creating an environment through site selection where you locate the program, what it looks like. Staff selection, determining how you choose staff to work with girls. Program development, actually stepping back and saying, when a girl leaves our program, what do we want her to leave with? And then back mapping into what you need to be providing, really developing a program. And then thinking about the content and material. And all of this needs to reflect an understanding of the lives of women and girls and address and respond to their strengths and challenges. Now, a few years ago, I started an experiment because I had gotten so, after doing this a lot of years, you sometimes get frustrated. And so I would take material I had written with women or material I'd written for girls, and I'd be in a co-ed program or agency, and I would say, gee, I wrote this intervention for girls. Why don't you try it with the boys? And the director would say, absolutely not. We would never give the boys something written for girls. Or I'd say, oh, I wrote this book for women, but I think the men could just translate. Oh, absolutely not. They'd be so offended. So then what I say to them is, then why do you continue to give the girls the material written for boys? Why do you continue to give women material written for men and just tell them to translate it? We would never do it in the reverse. But historically, it's what we've done. And it makes our interventions less effective, because if you can't engage, if someone can't relate to the material, it's hard for them to believe it's going to be helpful to them. And we want to address really the whole girl. We want to think about all the different parts of who she is in her life and the various domains. So there's the physical issues, her health, her development, the sexual issues, her development, again, particularly impacted if there's been sexual abuse, her relationships, thinking about her emotional development, her intellectual and her spiritual development. Now, one of the things we've learned because of all these new, more sophisticated brain scans that I mentioned earlier, they really show us that the only way we can help girls who've experienced trauma change how they feel is they have to become aware of their inner experiences. They have to learn what's going on inside them. And basically, for many of them, this is what they've been running away from. This is what's felt overwhelming. This is what has felt frightening. This is why people use alcohol and drugs. You use alcohol and other drugs, you're able to numb yourself. You don't have to feel. And so for many girls, what they've been doing is trying to numb themselves out, and yet what we realize is part of our work in working with a girl who's a trauma survivor is to help her get to a place where it's safe enough she can begin to look at her inner self and her feelings. And, you know, we live in a world, and girls' world in particular, very externally focused. How do I look? What do people think of me? It's all about the external. And so a lot of the work and working with girls is about turning inward and looking at what's happening inside their bodies. So I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of different programs. One is Voices that I've written for girls. The theory is there are 5 theories that are integrated to create the foundation for this, looking at girls' psychological development, attachment theory, theory of resilience, how do some girls make it and some girls don't, certainly addiction theory and trauma theory. So these are the theories that I have integrated in order to create the foundation. There are 4 modules with exercises in each one of these modules. One module focuses on self, helping a girl to answer the question, who am I? Looking at connecting with others, looking at family and friends and dating relationships, healthy living, thinking about mind, body, and spirit, and then the journey ahead and learning about decision making and thinking into the future. So we have Voices as a program for girls. Beyond Trauma is an intervention I've written for women that I've just rewritten, literally just came out a couple days ago. There are 12 sessions, and at the end of each session I've adapted it for girls so that there could be a gender-responsive trauma intervention for girls. And some of those interventions, some of those adaptations are here. One is we have found that girls don't often use language of trauma or abuse, but they talk about a painful experience or a difficult experience or a bad time in their life. So we use that language. There's some wheels here that come out of the domestic violence world. I'll show you the teen versions of those. And then the ACE questions that I gave you earlier, we have those questions for the girls to answer. We suggest they answer them for themselves and maybe for their best friend and for their mom. Or whoever's in the role of mother. So there are a whole variety of adaptations, as I said, for each session to make this very workable with girls. So the Teen Power and Control Wheel as I said, comes out of the domestic violence world, where the domestic violence world says power and control is at the center of violence. So we have physical and sexual violence in the outer part of the wheel, power and control is the center, and then the spokes in the wheel talk about different behaviors that are indicative of forms of abuse. So we use this as a teaching tool with girls about their relationships. A number of years ago, the statistic was 1 out of every 5 girls in a dating relationship was being abused, and a few years ago that changed to 1 out of every 3 girls in a dating relationship is being abused. So, but when you talk to girls, they'll say, "Oh no, no, it's not really abuse. It's just, he's jealous. He loves me so much." So teaching what abuse is very important. We also talk about some warning signs that can be abusive, things that people, again, don't often think of when they think about abuse per se. Things to do with the cell phone, the jealousy, explosion, making false accusations, lots of issues around control and possessiveness. So again, teaching the girls about that. And we also use this wheel that also comes out of the domestic violence world. This is the teen equality wheel, and showing nonviolent, what happens in a nonviolent relationship, and what are the qualities in there. And we also talk about what does that look like in a relationship. What does respect look like, and what does honesty and responsibility and fairness look like? So teaching the girls about, as I said, one of the important things is teaching what abuse is. So we do it in this kind of way. The other thing that's very important are coping skills, which I mentioned before. And having coping skills, and this is one of many of the grounding exercises we use with girls. Now, we talked about triggers. Those are the sight, sound, smell, something in the environment that when the girl experiences it, it pushes her back in time so that she's flooded by the feelings that she had during the abusive experience. And so a grounding exercise is something that keeps you in the here and now. It keeps you in the moment. So the 5 senses activity is one that we do. And so we have the girls just name to themselves 5 things they can see in the environment they're in at the moment. 4 things they can touch, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste. And you all can try this right now where you are. Just say to yourself, wherever you are here on the webinar, 5 things you can see. Name 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And what you find is it brings you right back into this moment, into this time. And this helps girls have a sense of safety. Now you'll see how this is put sort of as a card. At the end of the webinar, you'll have our email address. And we have this set up as a 1-page thing that we could actually email you, and you can Xerox it, cut these out, and give each girl a card. A lot of places also laminate it if you're in a place where they are allowed something that's laminated. And then the girls carry these with them to remind themselves of this exercise. So this is one of many grounding exercises. We do teach a lot of breathing exercises, which is another form of grounding. So lots of ways to cope. Coping strategies are very important. The other thing I'd like to share with you is the tier system for girls. And this is a trauma-informed effective reinforcement system. It's really a behavioral motivation system versus a behavior management system. It's been used successfully in girls' residential and detention settings. Again, it's trauma-informed. It's very relational, strength-based. And when we get to the end of the webinar, you will see there'll be a reference list in which you will be able to see where you can get some of these things that I have mentioned. But we have found it very effective to think about how we're going to develop and run environments for girls is very important, as well as the interventions that we use with them specifically. And ultimately, you know, what's really important is resilience, is helping build girls' resilience. I think so often when we're talking to girls in the juvenile justice system, we're amazed at how resilient they've been given all the difficulties they have faced. But we want to even expand on that. You know, the word resilience means leap back. It means something happens to you and you're able to come back again. So often what happens for girls, and you know, they're young. They're, as we talked about, those first 5 years, the brain is in development. So in their youth, they experience something that really pushes them off track, that they're going on in life, they're feeling happy, things are going okay. There's a traumatic experience, and they often talk about it's like being moved on to a different path. They often give up what they hoped for themselves in their lives. They end up getting into drugs, which is not something they wanted to do. They end up hanging out with people that are problematic. They weren't able to leap back. It's basically the trauma derailed them. And we certainly know that some people are just naturally more resilient. We know this in our adult lives from the people that we work with and know. Some people just seem to be more resilient. But we also can help develop resilience in girls. And we do that. How people develop their resiliency, how girls develop, is by they get better coping skills, and it comes from supporting, caring relationships. And those are the two things that are most critical, helping girls to expand their repertoire of coping skills, but doing that in the context of caring relationships. And so our final slide before we begin to take questions is, and ultimately all of this, what really makes a difference? One is creating a safe environment. And we know that girls are in many environments that really aren't safe, and they need to be safe physically, but they also need to be safe emotionally. And often in justice settings, because of a sense of security, things are done that really are not emotionally safe and sometimes really not physically safe. And when we consider trauma and all the things we've been talking about earlier this afternoon, we can see that many of the standard operating practices really are not safe for girls who are trauma survivors. We're actually doing things that escalate exactly what we don't want to have to deal with. Okay. So the environment is really important. And the word that I often use that I think says it all is the word sanctuary, which means a peaceful place, right, a refuge. And what would it be like in juvenile justice if we created places that when a girl stepped into them, she felt like she was stepping into a sanctuary? The other thing is listening to her story, and it's listening to her story when she wants to tell it, not when we are saying we need it for our record or our file or whatever. But listening to her story, the story is very powerful. And I like sharing with people the story that I heard a number of years ago. Richard Molina is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who a number of years ago set up a drop-in center with other young residents at Harvard for people fleeing Cambodia because of all the terrorism in that country. And they didn't speak Khmer, but they had translators, and a woman came to see him. She said a few things through the translator and left. 5 years went by. And she came back and she said to him, I had to go learn English in order to tell you my story. And I think that tells us the power of the story. It also tells us, I think, that what she sensed in him was empathy. She sensed that this is the man she wanted to tell her story to. And it's very important, you know, you hear a lot, we've all heard a lot about evidence-based practice. There are over 1,000 studies that tell us the most important thing is the therapeutic alliance, is the connection or the relationship between the person receiving services and the helping professional. And in that therapeutic alliance, it's the empathic moment. It's that time when a girl is going to share something important to her with one of us. And when that happens, it is most critical that we be able to say something back to her that she knows she's been seen and heard, because that, in fact, is what allows for the healing moment, is empathy. So those are the three things that really make a difference. That safe environment, a sense of sanctuary, listening to her story, and the empathic moment. And so I'll be happy now to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
You know, as you were going through the presentation, I saw, you know, a lot of our participants typing some questions in. So
sure.
I know that we have, you know, a few minutes here, and so I'd like to, you know, pose some of the questions.
Sure.
So the first one is that, you know, you presented statistics from a Canadian study around gender
Yes.
and rape. One of the questions is, do you have any of similar statistics for the U.S.?
No, I don't know anyone who's asked that same question. I mean, we have
Okay.
other statistics looking, I don't know any study that's asked that particular question. We certainly have statistics in the U.S. on the abuse that girls have experienced and boys have experienced, but not that specific question.
And then also, you know, you also presented information around the process of trauma, that flow chart, and
yes.
So we had one participant who wanted to know where they could get a copy of that.
We've got two options. I know that we could put handouts up on your website. We didn't do that because I didn't know exactly what people wanted, but we could do that if that would work. Does that work technically for you if we send it to you and you put it up on your website, or do you want people to email us and ask for it? Either way.
Yeah, we can do both. You know, we can
okay.
definitely.
Well, okay. So we will send the process of trauma chart to you, and it will be up on your website. Okay.
Excellent. Perfect. So we have another question here. In regards to trauma, how do we talk about or raise awareness, provide resources to those individuals who identify as transgender or gay in communities where, you know, these issues are prevalent? How do we, you know, the participant wants to know if, you know, how do we discreetly, if we have to do that, provide that type of information?
Well, I'm not sure what the issue is. I mean, are you saying that we present the information? I must be missing the question. If you're working with a transgender population, one of the things you say is, and we also say this to people, girls, is we know that a lot of people that we work with have had trauma in their life, and I'm not sure if this has happened for you or not, but we know it can have an impact, and we know that there are ways to provide help. So I don't know what you would say that would be different to a transgender person. You might say, we know that there's higher risk if you're a transgender person, but if you don't want to point that out, then you just say there are high rates of abuse. I'm not sure what the question is.
So there were, just in looking back at the question, is there any particular strategies that should be used to provide such information on trauma to that particular population?
So is the person working with a group of people, or is this a transgender person coming in to a program?
I think it would either, either within a programmatic setting.
Well, whoever comes into a program, I believe, when you're doing an intake, I don't believe in asking tons of questions about abuse, but I believe everybody coming for services should be told, what we've learned over the years is when people come in because they're struggling with mental health issues or they're struggling with substance abuse problems, or they've come into the people have come into the juvenile justice system. We know that so many of them have experienced abuse in their lives. And we don't know if this is true for you, and I don't know if you want to talk to me about that. But it's important for you to know that we've learned a lot and we have ways to be helpful.
Okay. And so another question here is, one of our participants is interested in learning how trauma, especially sexual abuse, is related to physical health issues like heart disease and autoimmune disorders.
Mm-hmm. What you're going to want to do is go to the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And if you go online and you Google that, you will see that there's a lot of information explaining about how when people have a high ACE score, now the high ACE score could be any, there are 10 questions, one of which is sexual abuse. But there are 10 questions that they have then looked at and then shown how they relate to physical health problems. Does
Okay,
that make sense?
Yes, and we'll just take one more question before we, close this out. So another participant wants to know, can misdiagnosis of trauma, as is the case with the misdiagnosis of other mental health disorders, lead to treatment that could actually make the trauma worse?
Yes, and that's often what we've had happen. Actually, I thought we had 15 minutes for question and answer, so I guess I'm sorry, I would have cut my presentation shorter. Yes, we do have situations where people have a trauma history and they go to get help, and what they're given actually makes it worse. We've seen this, for example, in traditional substance abuse treatment, where for years they said, we don't deal with trauma here. And they've had very confrontational ways of working with people who are substance abusers that have actually been harmful.
Okay.
And we see in the mental health profession where basically there's a lot of medication given, which is about symptom management, but it hasn't really helped what the person is really struggling with.
And then just one more question, Stephanie. So, you talked about the key elements of, addressing trauma, to learn about the trauma or the abuse, to understand the, typical responses and developing coping skills. Could you talk a little bit about the intersection of cultural and linguistic competence as it relates to those key elements? Are they, so how do we, focus this on, through a culturally competent lens also?
Well, I think first let's talk about language is really difficult because so many people are speaking different languages, and most of our programs are monolingual. So that's a huge thing. There are also cultural differences as to often what someone would consider abuse, as well as willingness to talk about it. And I think we have to understand that it has to be really something that the individual also is comfortable with sharing. Now, what we found over the years is educating people about what trauma is and what abuse is. We never, for example, the women who participate in the Beyond Trauma curriculum, we tell them you never have to discuss the event. in order to be in the process of healing. And so for many women, and the same with girls, they're willing to do things because they don't have to discuss what has actually happened.